Imagine standing at a crossroads where the familiar paths of the past no longer guarantee the destinations of the future. We're in such a moment now, a period of profound transformation in the global order. Throughout history, empires have risen and fallen, not randomly, but following discernible patterns. These cycles are driven by economic shifts, technological advancements, and societal changes. Today, we're witnessing similar forces at play, signaling a transition that will define the coming decades. If you study history objectively and remove the noise of individual events, you'll begin to notice something striking. The rise and fall of empires follow patterns. These patterns are not random. They're driven by fundamental forces that repeat over centuries. Understanding these forces is essential for anyone who wants to make sense of where we are and where we're going. Most people are caught up in the moment, reacting to headlines without seeing the larger arc. But if you zoom out and take a 100-year perspective, it becomes very clear that empires rise and fall in predictable cycles. It starts with the emergence of a new order. This typically comes after a period of conflict or revolution, when a new group comes into power and establishes a system that brings about peace, order, and productivity. In the early stage of an empire's rise, leadership is usually strong and unified. There's a sense of shared purpose, a drive to work hard, to innovate, and to save. Education and infrastructure are prioritized. Institutions are built. These are the seeds of prosperity. As this system becomes successful, productivity increases, trade expands, the empire becomes richer and more influential globally, its currency becomes widely used, its military becomes dominant, and it sets the rules of the global game. This is the golden age. During this phase, the rewards for being smart, hardworking, and cooperative are high. People believe in the system. The country gains reserve currency status, which gives it the exorbitant privilege of being able to borrow more easily and at lower cost. But success tends to breed excess. Over time, people become more entitled and less disciplined. The emphasis shifts from hard work and innovation to consumption and complacency. Debt begins to rise faster than income. Wealth gaps widen. Political and social divisions emerge. The internal unity that once made the empire strong begins to erode. At the same time, competitors from abroad, nations that are earlier in their own rise, begin to catch up. This middle to late stage of an empire's life is marked by increasing debt, slower productivity growth, and more conflict between the rich and the poor. Governments try to appease both sides by spending more and more, which usually means printing money and accumulating more debt. Asset bubbles form, the economy becomes more financialized, more speculative, and less grounded in real productivity. Eventually, this leads to what I call the big cycle turning point. The empire faces internal disorder, often in the form of populism, class conflict, or cultural fragmentation. At the same time, external rivals see an opportunity. They challenge the empire's dominance economically, technologically, and militarily. If the empire responds wisely and reforms itself, it can extend its period of influence. But if it doesn't, decline becomes inevitable. What typically follows is a period of increased conflict. Internally, there may be civil unrest, rebellion, or political paralysis. Externally, rising powers start to challenge the rules established by the declining empire. There may be trade wars, technology conflicts, and ultimately military confrontations. At this stage, trust in institutions erodes. The currency weakens, capital flees, the standard of living stagnates or declines for the majority. People lose faith in the future. Eventually, there's a reset. The old order collapses and a new one emerges. Sometimes this happens peacefully, but more often than not, it's accompanied by conflict, sometimes even large-scale war. Once the dust settles, the cycle begins anew, led by a different dominant power that has its own early-stage characteristics. of unity, discipline, and drive. If this sounds familiar, it should. We are now living through one of these major transitional periods. The United States, which has been the dominant global power since the end of World War II, is exhibiting many of the signs seen in declining empires of the past. Debt levels are historically high, political divisions are deep and emotional, productivity growth is sluggish, the wealth gap is larger than it has been in decades. Meanwhile, China is on the rise. Its economic size, technological capabilities, and military power are all expanding. It has become the most serious competitor the U.S. has faced in decades. But the goal here is not to sound alarmist. The goal is to be realistic. When you understand the long-term mechanics of how empires evolve, you gain a clearer picture of where we are and what might come next. You also learn that decline is not destiny. Countries and empires that understand the dynamics at play can adapt. They can make tough but necessary reforms. They can reinvent themselves. The key is self-awareness and the willingness to look at reality without illusion. That's why I study history, not to romanticize the past, but to understand the present more accurately and to prepare for the future more effectively. The patterns are there. The forces are repeating. And while you can't control the cycle, you can navigate it with much greater skill if you recognize the signs and respond wisely. So the question is not whether these cycles will continue. They always do. The real question is how you position yourself, your family, your business, your country in relation to them. Because in the end, those who align themselves with reality, however harsh or uncomfortable, are the ones who will not only survive, but thrive. Over the last several decades, few developments have been as consequential for the global balance of power as China's rise. For those who look at things in terms of long-term cycles, this isn't just a story of economic growth. It's the reemergence of a major civilization state that, for most of the last 1,000 years, led the world in areas such as technology, wealth, and governance. What we're witnessing is not a sudden ascent, but a return to a position that was historically the norm. Understanding this shift is essential because it has profound implications for geopolitics, economics, and the future of the world order. If you zoom out and look at the global picture through the lens of history, the rise of China is both expected and unprecedented. Expected in the sense that history has always seen the cyclical rise of new powers when conditions align. Unprecedented in terms of the speed, scale, and strategic precision with which China has emerged. From the time Deng Xiaoping initiated market reforms in the late 1970s, the country has moved from being one of the poorest nations on earth to the second largest economy by nominal GDP and the largest by purchasing power parity. It has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, built the world's largest infrastructure networks, and developed cutting-edge technologies across sectors. This didn't happen by accident. It was driven by a clear and sustained national strategy. China's leadership has demonstrated a remarkable ability to think in terms of decades rather than election cycles. They've studied the rise and fall of other powers and sought to avoid the same mistakes. The emphasis has been on saving, investment, education, and long-term planning. These are classic hallmarks of rising powers throughout history. They generate surpluses, invest them wisely, and build strong institutional foundations. Unlike many developed nations that have accumulated large debts to fund consumption, China has largely financed its development through internal savings and disciplined allocation of resources. The rise of China is not just economic, it is geopolitical. China has become increasingly assertive on the world stage. Through initiatives like the Belt and Road, it is extending its influence across Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe. It is developing alternatives to Western-led institutions and building new ones that reflect its own interests and values. It has become the largest trading partner for most countries in the world and is actively working to internationalize its currency. At the same time, it has modernized its military with a clear focus on technological superiority and strategic deterrence. These moves are not aggressive in the reckless sense, but are calculated efforts to protect national interests and project stability in regions critical to China's future. What makes this shift particularly important is that it comes at a time when the existing world order, led by the United States, is facing internal and external challenges. Historically, the most dangerous periods are when a rising power begins to close the gap with an established one. This is what historians refer to as the Thucydides trap. When a rising power threatens to displace a ruling one, conflict often follows. This doesn't mean war is inevitable, but the probability of misunderstanding, miscalculation, or escalation increases. The dynamic between the United States and China today is one of strategic competition. The United States has led the world for decades, but it now faces a rival that is playing the long game and building leverage across multiple dimensions. Economically, China is integrated with global supply chains in a way that gives it significant influence. Technologically, it is advancing in fields like AI, quantum computing, and green energy. Politically, it is proposing a different model of governance and development that some nations find appealing, especially those skeptical of Western-style liberal democracy. This is not a simple story of good versus bad or capitalism versus communism. It is a story of two systems with different strengths, weaknesses, and worldviews trying to coexist in a world where their interests increasingly intersect. That coexistence will not be easy. It will require wisdom, mutual respect, and an understanding of history. It will require both sides to recognize the stakes involved and the costs of escalation. For individuals, investors, and institutions, understanding the realities of China's ascendancy is not optional. It is necessary. Those who fail to see this shift clearly risk being caught off guard by its consequences. The world is entering a new chapter. The unipolar moment is over. We are heading into a multipolar world, and China will be one of its central pillars. Whether this transition is managed peacefully or leads to greater conflict will depend largely on how well both the rising and established powers navigate the realities before them. When you step back and examine the United States, not just as a country, but as an empire within a long historical cycle, you begin to see familiar signs that have appeared in every major power as it moves from its peak into relative decline. The United States remains one of the most powerful nations in the world by almost any measure, but it is also facing a convergence of internal and external challenges that reflect the later stages of the typical empire cycle. These challenges are not random. They are deeply rooted in structural realities and historical patterns that repeat themselves time and again. One of the most obvious and pressing issues is the enormous buildup of debt. The United States has spent decades borrowing more than it earns. When a country issues the world's reserve currency, it has the unique advantage of being able to borrow cheaply and in its own money. But that privilege can also become a trap. It encourages overconsumption and underinvestment in productive capacity. Today, total U.S. debt, government, corporate, and household, has reached levels that historically precede a shift in economic power. Eventually, the burden of debt becomes too great to sustain through normal means. That's when central banks begin to print more money to finance deficits, which devalues the currency and erodes trust in the system. Alongside rising debt is the widening wealth gap. the economic divide between the top and bottom has reached levels last seen in the 1930s. This creates not just economic inefficiency, but social fragmentation. When too much wealth accumulates at the top, while large portions of the population struggle to maintain basic living standards, tensions rise. History shows that when the gap between rich and poor gets too large, and when opportunity feels out of reach for many, societies become more polarized. In such environments, populist movements tend to gain traction. Extremes on both the left and right become more influential. Political gridlock becomes the norm. The middle ground collapses. This polarization is clearly visible in America today. The political system is deeply divided, with trust in government institutions declining across the board. The ability to reach consensus on even the most basic policies is increasingly rare. Political cycles are marked not by continuity and long-term planning, but by swings from one extreme to another. The result is inconsistency, short-termism, and growing public frustration. In the past, this kind of political fragmentation has made it difficult for empires to make the structural reforms necessary to reverse decline. Another major challenge is the erosion of the country's educational and social foundations. A strong empire is built on strong people. That means high-quality education, healthy communities, and a culture that values discipline, innovation, and shared purpose. Over time, the United States has allowed significant disparities to develop in its education system. Many young people are graduating without the skills required to compete in a rapidly changing global economy. Life expectancy in many parts of the country is declining due to issues like drug addiction, poor health, and mental illness. These are signs of a deeper social malaise that cannot be solved through economic policy alone. At the same time, the U.S. is facing increasing competition from abroad. China is the most obvious example. It has grown rapidly by applying many of the same principles that powered America's own rise: high savings, investment in infrastructure and education, centralized strategic planning, and a long-term vision. As China grows stronger, the U.S. must grapple with the reality that it no longer dominates in every arena. In technology, manufacturing, and even geopolitical influence, China is narrowing the gap. This shift creates friction, trade tensions, technological restrictions, and geopolitical flashpoints are symptoms of a larger power transition underway. But the greatest threat to the United States may not come from external rivals. It comes from within. The ability of a society to hold itself together during times of stress is a critical determinant of its durability. Right now, the fabric of American society is under strain. The shared narratives and common values that once bound the country together are fraying. The trust in media, government, and even each other has weakened. When citizens no longer believe in the system or in the good faith of those on the other side, the system itself becomes vulnerable. History does not repeat in exactly the same way, but it rhymes. The challenges the United States faces are not insurmountable, but they require humility, realism, and a willingness to look squarely at the truth. They require reforms that go beyond politics and address the root causes of decline. The question is not whether the U.S. can recover its strength. The question is whether it will choose to do what is necessary to adapt and evolve before the forces of decline become irreversible. The clock is ticking, and the choices made in the coming years will shape not only the nation's future, but the future of the world. Throughout history, technological advancement has always been one of the most powerful forces shaping empires, economies, and societies. It acts like a tide that lifts some boats and sinks others. The most successful civilizations have been those that were quick to adapt and apply new technologies productively. But the very same force that creates unprecedented opportunity also brings disruption, and disruption is often painful, especially for those who are not prepared. We are now living in a time of exponential technological change. The pace of innovation is faster than at any point in human history. Artificial intelligence, robotics, biotechnology, quantum computing, and other transformative technologies are not only reshaping industries, but redefining how value is created. This is no longer just about having a faster computer or a better phone. It is about how work is done, how societies function. The challenge with rapid technological advancement is that it tends to evolve much faster than our ability to understand or manage it. Economies and institutions that were built for slower, linear progress now face the challenge of staying relevant in a nonlinear world. Companies that thrived for decades can become obsolete within a few years if they fail to adapt. Labor markets are being fundamentally reshaped as machines take on tasks once performed by humans, and governments are struggling to regulate technologies they barely understand. This has real implications. One of the most significant is the effect on inequality. Historically, when new technologies emerge, they benefit those who have the skills, capital, and positioning to use them. Others are left behind. We are already seeing this play out. Workers in industries that are being automated are losing jobs or being pushed into lower wage work. Meanwhile, a small group of individuals and firms that control the most valuable technology assets are accumulating immense wealth. This creates a feedback loop that widens the wealth and opportunity gap. The economic effects ripple outward. Those who feel left behind become disillusioned. They lose faith in the system. This leads to social fragmentation and political polarization. You see this happening across many advanced economies. There is a growing divide between urban centers that are thriving in the new economy and rural or post-industrial areas that are falling behind. This kind of internal imbalance is one of the markers of an empire in transition. Another dimension of technological disruption is the way it is changing the nature of competition between nations. In the past, power was determined by land, resources, and military strength. Today, data, intellectual property, and computing power are just as critical. The countries that lead in artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and other advanced. This is why the rivalry between the United States and China is increasingly focused on technological superiority. It is not just about economics. It is about national security, influence, and control over the future rules of the game. At the same time, the ethical and societal implications of these technologies are immense. Artificial intelligence, for example, has the potential to outperform humans in many areas. This raises fundamental questions about employment, privacy, and decision-making. Who controls the algorithms? How are they trained? What happens when machines start making decisions that affect millions of lives? These are not just technical questions. They are moral, political, and strategic. And right now, most of our institutions are not equipped to answer them. Historically, when new technologies have emerged, societies have often gone through a period of chaos before establishing a new equilibrium. We are likely in such a period now. There is massive creative destruction underway. Old industries are collapsing while new ones are being born. The winners of tomorrow will not be those who resist change, but those who can adapt to it wisely. Adaptation, however, is not just about embracing every new tool, but it's about understanding what the technology means, how it fits into the broader system, and what second and third order consequences may arise. The key is to stay rooted in principles while remaining flexible in methods. Technologies come and go, but the fundamentals of strong leadership, sound decision-making, and wise governance remain the same. Societies that invest in education, foster open-minded thinking, and promote long-term planning will have a much greater chance of navigating disruption successfully. Those that become fragmented, short-sighted, or reactionary will likely suffer. We cannot stop the wave of technological disruption, nor should we want to. It is the engine of progress. But we can and must learn how to ride it. That requires honesty about where we are, clarity about where we are going, and the courage to make difficult but necessary changes. The future will be shaped by those who understand both the promise and the peril of the tools they wield. One of the most valuable things a person, a company, or a country can do is study history deeply. The patterns are there, the signs are consistent, the cycles repeat themselves with remarkable regularity. While the specifics change, the underlying cause and effect relationships remain largely the same. This is why understanding history is not just useful, but essential. It gives you perspective, which allows for better decision making. The further you look back, the further ahead you can see. Most people tend to think that the moment they are living in is unique. They view the challenges they face as unprecedented and the systems they live within as permanent. But if you look across thousands of years of history, you quickly realize that the rise and fall of empires, the boom and bust of markets, the periods of peace and conflict are all part of a larger repeating cycle. What has happened many times before will happen again. The only real question is where we are in the cycle. Empires follow predictable arcs. They are born from a combination of strong leadership, sound economic foundations, and a unifying purpose. They rise through productivity, innovation, and a meritocratic culture. At their peak, they are characterized by strength, wealth, and global influence. Over time, however, the same success breeds complacency. Debt rises, gaps widen, political and social cohesion erode, internal conflict grows, eventually decline sets in. This has happened over and over, from the Roman Empire to the Dutch, from the British to others in between. When I study history, I do not look at it nostalgically or emotionally. I look at it analytically. I ask what led to success and what led to failure. What were the conditions that created prosperity, and what were the signals that warned of decay? The answers are always there if you're willing to see them clearly and without bias. Often people ignore these lessons because they are uncomfortable or because they conflict with what they want to believe. But reality does not care about opinions. It moves forward based on principles that are constant. Take the issue of debt, for example. Excessive debt has been a leading indicator of decline in virtually every major economy. It allows people to spend more than they earn and governments to promise more than they can deliver. For a while, this creates the illusion of prosperity, but eventually the bills come due. Debts either get paid back with real money, which is painful, or with printed money, which leads to devaluation. Both paths have consequences, and history is full of examples showing how nations handled them well or poorly. Another consistent lesson from history is that internal conflict tends to rise as the wealth gap widens. When the majority of people feel they are not participating in economic success, they become disillusioned with the system. Trust breaks down. Polarization increases. The middle ground disappears. This leads to populism, civil unrest, and sometimes revolution. We have seen this many times throughout history. France in the late 1700s, Russia in the early 1900s, Germany in the 1930s. These are not anomalies. They are outcomes of deeply rooted structural imbalances. Studying these moments helps clarify how important it is to create inclusive prosperity and to design systems that are fair and sustainable. It shows the value of long-term thinking over short-term gratification. It also highlights the need for strong institutions, rule of law, and social contracts that bind people together rather than pull them apart. When these elements erode, decline accelerates. When they are strengthened, renewal becomes possible. One of the greatest risks of not learning from history is arrogance. When people believe they are exceptional or immune from the forces that brought others down, they are setting themselves up for failure. This kind of thinking is dangerous because it ignores the reality that human nature has not changed. The same incentives, fears, and desires drive behavior today as they did 1,000 years ago. Technology evolves, societies evolve, but people are still people. Learning from the past requires humility. It requires the willingness to look at uncomfortable truths and to accept that no system lasts forever. But it also offers hope, because just as decline is a recurring pattern, so is renewal. The key is to recognize where you are in the cycle and to act accordingly. Those who study history carefully with a clear and open mind are more likely to make the right decisions when the stakes are highest. And those decisions will shape the world to come. In these transformative times, understanding the forces at play is not just academic, it's essential. By recognizing patterns, assessing current dynamics, and learning from history, we equip ourselves to make informed decisions. The world order is changing. Question is, will we adapt and thrive or cling to the past and falter? The choice is ours. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. Stay informed, stay curious, and let's navigate this changing world together.